Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are continuing our examination of Greek sculpture, and what we're going to talk about today are temple pediment sculptures. And there is a great collection of sculptures on the same temple created about a decade apart that tell the story, this rapid progress towards incredible naturalism in the description of the human body that you find beginning in the Archaic period, but bridging now into the early classical age as well. So this is what we're going to find, that the two sides of this program of pediment sculptures, one side done at one point in time, a decade later, the other side completed, shows this rapid change, this quest towards the perfection of the description of the human body in terms of proportions, behavior, description of realistic situations and how that would be rendered in a compassionate way. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Moving on to our PowerPoint here, let me line up the slide I want to begin with. And I'll just make myself disappear here for just a minute here. All right, so what we're looking at is a temple found on the island of Aegina in Greece, and it is the temple of Aphaia. It is an artist's rendering of what it likely looked like when it was in its most perfect glory. As you can see, just like we talked about with our Archaic period sculpture, it would have been vividly painted. And we are looking as just a refresher at what kind of order of temple? That's right, it's a Doric temple, and you can tell by the disc-shaped capitals on those fluted columns that form the porch to the entrance of the sanctuary, and then the alternating triglyphs and metopes that sit below this pediment element here, part of the kind of peaked roof of Greek temples. Now, what you find with Greek temples, as I've mentioned before, is you find an abundance of decoration. And I'm talking about sculpture, whether freestanding sculpture or sculpture reliefs that decorates either the metopes in the Doric order, or you find in both the Ionic and Doric orders pediment sculpture. Now, remember, the idea of balance and harmony exists in the Greek values, and that translates into their arts and architecture as well. So the front of a Greek temple is going to look like the back as well. So there will be a colonnade of columns, and then above it, a pediment that faces both the east and west sides of the temple of Aphaia. Aphaia, you were probably scratching your head saying, what god or goddess is this? Aphaia was a nymph. So nymphs are more like demigods that are associated as female deities of forests and rivers, that kind of thing. So, all right, moving on to our next slide. Oh, first, take a peek here. Remember we talked about the challenge of a pediment is its triangular shape. So how do you fill that with sculpture without shrinking people, right? In this particular scene, it's the battle of the Greeks and the Trojans. Athena, the star of the show, gets center place. She gets to stand up at the tallest positioning on that pediment. But you might notice as the pediment tapers downward, things get a little bit more cramped. What you find is the sculptors have a desire to keep all of the figures to scale, meaning they don't want to like make some big and shrink some down to fit all those narrow spaces. They do start to show them very in crouching fighting poses, that's for sure. But what about the hardest locations? And this is the tough assignment, that's the tough real estate of the pediment, are the corners. What do you do with them? Well, showing you our next slide, and I'll come back to you for that. Hello again. We have examples of what was positioned on both sides of the two pediments, front and back, or east I beg your pardon, west, and then east is the newer one. And they both depict dying warriors, right? Remember, this is a battle scene between the Greeks and the Trojans here. So the image on the top is the dying warrior executed for the older west pediment side of the Temple of Aphaia from 490 BCE. So it is a marble sculpture. It is an actual sculpture versus a sculptural relief, which would have been more common on a metope, for instance. These are relatively life-size sculptures. You have to think about looking up from ground level at the temple pediment. You need to be able to have them large enough for you to read them with the human eye. Now, he is very reminiscent of our archaic Greek sculpture, right? We see the beginnings of a believability with naturalism. His body is in proportion. You know, we don't have arms that are too long or a head that's too large, that kind of thing. So that is believable, and part of the naturalism we saw in the archaic world pretty rapidly moving away from the very strictly geometric shaped bodies to bodies that look like they have an anatomical structure, you know, bones with musculature, kind of this mix of suppleness and firmness that makes up the human body. Now, what you see here is he grips with his right hand something that has impaled him, and that is some kind of a fatal wound, right? An arrow or a staff, something has happened. And he props himself on one elbow as he has collapsed and wounded in battle. Now, look at his body here. You can just sort of connect the dots between the tops of his toes to the kneecap to the top of the head, and there you can see how he would fit nicely into that tight triangular shape of a temple pediment. The only thing that's a little bit unnaturalistic about this particular warrior is he looks a little bit like he's attending his Pilates or yoga class at his local gym, the way he's sort of propped up on one elbow, about to do a side plank. Not sure that really depicts the amount of pain and suffering one would feel if that kind of wound were to happen to you. The other thing that's very common to archaic period sculpture is the patternized hair, right? We see lots of pattern forming, the coiled long hair that was typical of that era, as well as that archaic smile. Now remember, the archaic smile isn't really meant to convey laughter or joy. It's just a slight upturn to the mouth to enliven the face, to make it look more like a human that's alive. But it still reads like a smile, and for a dying warrior, that just doesn't seem to work at all, does it? What does work is what was created about a decade later. So when they got around to doing the sculpture for the East Pediment, very similar theme, you find that in that same corner, you have another dying warrior. So you can just kind of draw with your mind's eye this corner of that pediment and how he would fit nicely in that location. But in this instance, not only do we have a naturalism in anatomy, muscle groupings, and proportions, but also we have more of a believability of an instantaneous kind of trauma or wound that befell this warrior from antiquity, right? We see that his arm is still trapped in his shield. The warrior is helmeted, so there are the accoutrements of battle accompanying this depiction of a fallen warrior. He uses his arm in a believable way as well to kind of keep himself propped up, but of course weakness is overtaking him and gravity is pulling him downward, and we have a sense of that inevitability, of the finality of his death coming soon with his downward gaze. So it's not the face looking out brightly at you, the viewer, but downcast, as if to collect his final thoughts. It's a statue that invites more of the viewer's empathy, right, and sympathy of the cost of war. So as we transition finally from being in the last decade of the Archaic period to the year 480, this is when we start to transition away from the Archaic period to early Classical Greek era. And you can see that they've nailed the physical body, the accuracy of proportions, but now we start to see what they're interested in is creating not only an accurate description of the human body, but a believable presentation of the subject in the context, in this case, a battle. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you next time about more Greek art. Bye.